The preface to the first volume of Capital ends with a motto about intellectual autonomy, or rather about intellectual autonomy and the attitude toward reception that serves it best. Altering a line from Dante's Divine Comedy, Karl Marx pledges to live by the words, "Go on your own way and let the people talk." He certainly managed to act in accord with the first clause, nowhere more so than in Capital itself. In this genre-transcending work, Marx aspires to the strictest conceptual rigor and documents his claims comprehensively. It also cracks wise, operates in a declamatory key, and gives free rein to his imaginative powers, telling readers, for example, what commodities would say if they could speak. As for letting the people talk, that proved to be a greater challenge. The afterword Marx produced for the second edition of his book makes it clear that he studied as many responses to the first edition as he could find, and that he was easily annoyed by slights and grateful for validation, even when it came from sources he disliked. Style, broadly speaking, figures prominently here. Marx brings up his mode of presentation more than a few times, famously asserting that it had to differ from the mode of investigation, and faulting commentators for failing to see how he built off the latter when he developed the former. In a footnote, the last of thousands, some of which fill up multiple pages in Capital, he strikes back at, and now I'm quoting, the mealy-mouthed scatterbrains of vulgar German political economy who have criticized the way my book is written and also the way its analysis is presented. Vulgar in this context means tendentious and superficial, and Marx avows that he himself judges the literary defects, and that's his phrase, of his magnum opus much more harshly than these lightweight naysayers, or in fact, than anyone. He doesn't say, however, which flaws he has in mind. Instead, he adduces two favorable accounts of his style. One lauds it for injecting charm into even the driest problems of political economy. The other appreciates its unusual liveliness. Thus began a discussion that has played a small yet vibrant role in Marx's studies, a discussion in which the literary features of Capital have been prized, sometimes explicitly defended, and generally treated as non-incidental, non-ornamental aspects of the text. This line of commentary stretches from statements by Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels to Sian Guy's and William Clare Roberts' recent contributions, running through writings by Wilhelm Liebknecht, Edmund Wilson, Marshall Berman, Ludovico Silva, Robert Paul Wolff, and Jacques Derrida. It has addressed a variety of topics, including some of the mimetic techniques that Krauss employs in Capital, such as his parodying of classical political economy and his freewheeling style of literary quotation, which we just encountered, or encountered above with his Dante quotation, which, as I said, is a reworked quotation, not the words that Dante actually wrote. What has been overlooked, to the best of my knowledge, is perhaps the most innovative of those techniques, Marx's use of free indirect discourse. For while certain occurrences of free indirect discourse in Capital anticipate later developments in literary modernism, they are not especially conspicuous in contrast to Marx's much-quoted vampire and werewolf tropes and his Faust reworkings, a sensuous, supersensuous thing, and so on. Tellingly, the original English translations done by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling, the original English translation done by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling more or less dropped them, these occurrences of free and direct discourse, and the same goes for Ben Fowkes' translation, which generations of Anglophone readers have depended on for access to Marx's text. So I try to avoid the agonistic thing that people, sometimes get into and presenting their translation in relation to previous translation. As Shelley mentioned, I do like to think of it as translation, but this doesn't preclude, I think, pointing out where other people have left important things out for various reasons, which I'm not going to get into, but if you look at their translations in context, it makes sense why they might do this, even though when you think about it, it is also pretty astonishing because these moments are, while subtle, extremely innovative. And I'm going to try to make the case for that in the next few minutes. It's not going to be like a full academic talk, a mini talk. followed by a mini reading. So, what is Marx achieving when, rather than having a hypothetical capitalist speak directly, he engages in a kind of third-person imitation, reporting thoughts and utterances in a way that allows him to slide in and out of the hypothetical capitalist's standpoint? How do we make sense of this investment of creative energy? Well, let's turn to the instance of free and direct imitation in capital that I've just been describing and see what we come up with. This example occurs in the chapter on the labor process and the valorization process, chapter 5 in our edition. Here Marx takes up a point that he stresses in the previous chapter, where he reveals the secret of how surplus value is produced. Neither capitalists nor political economists really understand how surplus value comes about, hence secret. The previous chapter evokes at length the political economist's way of misunderstanding its production. The chapter on the labor process and the valorization process represents the capitalist's wrong-headed perspective, doing so, however, in the free and direct mode. Marx has a hypothetical capitalist fail to produce surplus value, even though he successfully makes yarn for which there is a market. In other words, the capitalist fails to produce surplus value, even though he does all the things required for that. He puts money into means of production, hires a worker, and produces a commodity that can be sold at its value. This leaves him confused. According to Marx, the capitalist doesn't know about the valorization process, the non-natural capitalist process whereby surplus value is generated, which isn't the same as the labor process, a natural, visible process common to all human societies. Thus, the capitalist can't know that the former process begins only when a worker works longer than his own worker did and starts to perform unpaid labor, or only after the part of the workday when the worker brings about value equivalent to that of his labor power. Our capitalist can't believe it, Marx writes. The product's value merely equals the value of the capital he advanced. The value he advanced hasn't valorized itself. It hasn't created surplus value, hence it hasn't transformed money into capital. What is this capitalist to think? And now here's Marx operating in this mode of free and direct imitation. Our capitalist might have found solace in the idea that virtue is its own reward. But instead, he starts to raise his voice. The yarn is of no use to him. He made it in order to sell it. Thus, he should sell it. Or better yet, he should produce only things that satisfy his own wants and needs. A trusted therapy that McCulloch, who's a vulgar political economist in Marx's view, whom Marx liked to make fun of, his name comes up quite a bit in Capital, a trusted therapy that McCulloch, his personal doctor, has prescribed to help against the epidemic of overproduction. Our capitalist now becomes defiant and defensive, rearing up on his hindquarters. He asks, can a worker make commodities out of thin air simply by using his arms and legs? Didn't he supply his worker with the material the worker needed to embody his labor, and in which his labor is thus embodied? Given that penniless persons make up the vast majority of society, hasn't our capitalist rendered an immeasurable service to society by providing the means of production, namely the cotton and the spindle? Hasn't he done the worker a great service too by giving him his means of subsistence? And shouldn't he get something in return for this service? This isn't what narratologists would call classic free and direct discourse, which they tend to define as occurring where a character's thoughts are related by a narrator in the third person, but in the character's language, or in a mix of the character's language and the narrator's, so that it can be hard to tell whose perspective readers are getting. In the passage just quoted, the perspective is sometimes marked more clearly than it is in classic free and indirect discourse, Marx says. He asks and uses markers like that. And it's sometimes stressed that the capitalist is speaking rather than reflecting in his head. He begins to raise his voice, for example. Marx explicitly notes that. But the basic features of modernist free and direct discourse are present, more so than otherwise in German letters before 1900. The fragmentary first instance of free indirect discourse there is thought to have come in Georg Büchner's drama Lenz, 1839, which was followed by some not very successful experiments around 1850 by the critic novelist Otto Ludwig. What we find in Capital is much more developed. There is a sliding from the capitalist's perspective, thus he should produce only things that satisfy his own wants and needs, into Marx's, a trusted therapy prescribed by McCulloch. At the same time, the capitalist's language, can a worker make commodities out of thin air, simply by using his arms and legs, slides into Marx's, in which his labor is embodied, the worker's labor is embodied, thereby evoking an instability or a lack of firm footing that corresponds to the weak intellectual agency Marx ascribes to capitalists in the capitalist system. Never truly in control of his discourse, since it is narrated monologue rather than direct monologue, the capitalist loses control of it outright. There is also a proto-Kafkaesque combination of mockery and empathy. The emigre scholars Leo Spitzer and Dorrit Cohn suggested that free indirect discourse invites both. The capitalist has an economic personal doctor whom Marx liked to ridicule, McCulloch, yet the capitalist's voice isn't always clearly set off from Marx's. Both the mockery and the empathy make sense. The capitalist offers up shibboleths of vulgar political economy in which he is well-versed, such as, hasn't he done a great service to society? Shibboleths, by the way, that are very much alive in present-day capitalist self-justifications. But his consternation is understandable. The system in which he operates is fundamentally non-transparent, which is, in fact, the theoretical point Marx is emphasizing here, and also a plight with which Kafka's characters are very familiar. In addition, both Marx and Kafka play off the formal air that free and direct discourse can have. Its compositional and cognitive demands are such that it isn't used in casual conversation in German and sometimes works, as it does in Capital, with a subjunctive form that has elevated associations. The formality creates a context in which the madcap moments feel all the wackier for feeling a little out of place, rearing up on his hindquarters, and so on. And this was a pretty major translation challenge for me, calibrating the language to have that particular degree of formality and that mix of wackiness and formality playing off each other. Elsewhere in Capital, Marx carries out an imitation upward, telling readers how the political economist, Nassau Sr., another of his preferred targets, would have to continue if he were more clear-sighted about surplus value production, and doing so to some extent in an enhanced version of Senior's own style. It's a mode of mimesis that simultaneously recalls the double voicing Heinrich Heine pioneered in his book about his fellow German-Jewish critic Ludwig Börne, and that anticipates the humiliating, annihilating techniques for breaking down and showing up employed by Karl Kraus. Walter Benjamin was being only semi-hyperbolic when he remarked about Kraus, after he imitates someone, he emerges with blood dripping from his lips. One could argue, in fact, I would argue, that the creative practices of imitation in Capital have further functions. As with other moments of creative writing in the book, they serve as a vehicle for Marx to model the kind of multi-sided work that the book treats as essential to human flourishing. Marx certainly believed in the power of deep expertise, but he also thought the narrowing of work, intellectual and otherwise, mutilated people. And here's a quote on that from Capital. Whereas simple cooperation does little to change the way an individual worker works, the manufacturing system revolutionizes his mode of labor from the bottom up, seizing the individual bearer of labor power by the roosts. It stunts the worker, turning him into a freak, for it acts as a hothouse for developing a particular skill by forcing him to suppress a whole world of drives and proclivities, just as in the states of La Plata, whole animals are slaughtered merely for their hides or fat. So when Marx refuses to abide by the norms of scholarly writing and to suppress his literary inclinations, his first career goal, by the way, was to be a poet, he is acting on his theoretical commitments and asserting a certain freedom. which seems like a good note to end on today, except that there is still this little reading. I would like to read the entire passage where Marx imitates the hypothetical capitalist from the third person. So you'll get twice the passage that I read, which comes from this larger passage, but, well, we're talking about mimesis, so doubling is, perhaps appropriate. So I've already set up this quotation. The capitalist, the hypothetical capitalist, has done all the things you need to do to produce surplus value and has failed to produce surplus value, all the things you need to do for surplus value except to have the worker work past the part of the workday when necessary labor, in Marx's language, is performed, and into the part of the workday when surplus labor is performed, which, according to Marx, is the labor that produces surplus value. Our capitalist, who is well versed in vulgar political economy, will perhaps say that he advanced money in order to make more money. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and he might just as well have intended to make money without producing a thing. He warns that he won't be caught off guard again. From now on, he will buy his commodity ready-made in the market instead of producing it himself. But if all his capitalist brothers were to do that, where in the market would he find his commodities? And he can't make a meal out of his money. He begins to sermonize. One should appreciate his abstinence. He could have frittered away his 15 shillings, but he spent them productively, using them to manufacture yarn, and he has yarn now rather than pangs of conscience. What he must not do is amass wealth by simply taking it out of circulation. We have seen what such asceticism brings. Not only that, where there is nothing, the emperor has lost his rights, and whatever the merit of the capitalist act of renunciation may be, he can't be compensated for it because there is nothing to compensate him with. In this case, the process yields a product whose value merely equals the combined value of the commodities he put into it. Our capitalist might have found solace in the idea that virtue is its own reward, but instead he starts to raise his voice. The yarn is of no use to him. He made it in order to sell it, thus he should sell it. Or better yet, he should produce only things that satisfy his own wants and needs, a trusted therapy that McCulloch, his personal doctor, has prescribed to help against the epidemic of overproduction. Our capitalist becomes defiant and defensive, rearing up on his hindquarters. He asks, can a worker make commodities out of thin air simply by using his arms and legs? Didn't he supply his worker with the material the worker needed to embody his labor, and in which his labor is thus embodied? Given that penniless persons make up the vast majority of society, hasn't our capitalist rendered an immeasurable service to society by providing the means of production, namely the cotton and the spindle? Hasn't he done the worker a great service too by giving him his means of subsistence? And shouldn't he get something in return for this service? But hasn't the worker, in fact, done our capitalist an equivalent service by turning the cotton and the spindle into yarn? Moreover, the notion of service is out of place here. A service occurs when a use value, whether a commodity or labor, exerts useful effects. For the moment, however, what matters is exchange value. Our capitalist paid the worker value amounting to 3 shillings. The worker paid the capitalist back exactly the same quantity of value with the 3 shillings of value he added to the cotton. Value for value. Our friend, who'd been cocky in the way of capital, suddenly takes on his worker's modest demeanor. Hasn't he worked too? Hasn't he performed the labor of overseeing, of managing the spinner? Shouldn't his work too generate value? The capitalist's own overlooker and his manager shrug at this. In the meantime, he has begun to grin broadly. His old expression is already back. His whole speech was just a ploy. Such discussions don't interest him at all. He will leave the lazy excuses and shallow arguments to the people who are paid to deliver them, professors of political economy. He is a practical man, and while he might not always know what he's talking about elsewhere, when it comes to business, he knows what he's doing. Thank you for listening and for being here, and again, thank you so much for the award. It's a great honor.